Hola, ¿qué tal? Bienvenidos. Mi nombre es Andrés Vázquez, soy estudiante de ciencia política, pero con un gran interés en la apologética cristiana. Bienvenidos a Imago Dei. Imago Dei nació con el fin de postular información correspondiente a la apologética y teología cristiana. Ahora sí, quiero presentar a nuestro invitado de hoy. Nuestro invitado es el doctor Mike Licona. Es un placer, un honor tener a Mike Licona aquí en el canal. El doctor Mike Licona tiene un doctorado en el Nuevo Testamento de la Universidad de Pretoria. Además, es miembro de las sociedades evangélicas, teológicas y filosóficas del Instituto de Investigación Bíblica, de la Sociedad de Literatura Bíblica, entre otros. Además, el doctor Mike es profesor asociado de teología en la Universidad Bautista de Houston y presidente de Rising Jesus. So, welcome, Mike. It's a huge privilege for me to have you here.
Well, Andrew, it's the privilege is mine.
Yes, and as I have told you before, your work has had a great impact on my life. Support to Christian apologetics, especially on a very important topic like the resurrection.
Well, so, resurrection's one of the best. It's one of the most important ones out there, isn't it?
Yes. So before we start with the interview, why don't you introduce yourself for those who don't know you or don't know what you do?
Well, I'm 58 years old. I'll be 59 in a couple of months. I grew up in Baltimore, Maryland, here in the United States. My dad was from Honduras, and he died about 17 years ago. But so he was from Honduras, and so I'm 50% Latino. He moved to the United States back, I'm guessing it was the 1950s is when he moved, met my mom, they married. And anyway, I grew up in Baltimore, and later on I went to college, to grad school, then got my doctorate, and now I teach at Houston Baptist University.
And do you speak Spanish or not?
I do not speak Spanish. I took a little bit while I was in high school. My parents split up when I was 5 years old. My dad was an alcoholic, and he was not sexually faithful to my mom, and abused her physically, and so she left him when I was 5 years old. So she remarried later on, and I had a great stepdad. My dad remarried, moved back to Honduras. My stepmom is there, and she's a great woman, and I keep in touch with her.
Well, once again, thank you so much for being here and for accepting this interview. So let's start with it. I want to talk in this interview about the resurrection, the reliability of the Gospels, and some objections to these topics. But before we talk about these issues and related topics, I would like to hear a little bit about your testimony. How did you become a Christian and things like that?
I was 10 years old at the time, and I'd been looking. I'd asked, my mom on several occasions, how do I get to heaven? I was asking her this when I was like 7 or 8 years old, and she would just say, well, you just have to do more good than bad. And I said, well, what if I do more bad than good? Because I had a younger sister, and I used to hit her and pull her hair and make her cry. And she said, well, if you do more bad than good, then you go to be with the devil in hell forever. And I was always wondering, well, where am I on that scale? Have I done more good than bad, or where am I? And then at age 10, I was in church, and a magician came in. They pulled all the Sunday school classes together, and the magician would show all these tricks, but he would relate the gospel message to his magic. And for the first time in my life, I began to understand that it was nothing that I could do to have eternal life and get to heaven. It's what Jesus did for me on the cross, dying for my sins, and that it was a free gift. that I just needed to take and follow him. And at the end, I was at a Presbyterian church, but at the end, the Christian magician gave a invitation, just like Billy Graham had done. And there was probably 50 of us students in the class. Again, I was only like 10 years old at the time, but I remember thinking, this is exactly what I've been looking for. And I went forward. I remember it was me and 2 other girls. And I was thinking, well, I don't know why all the rest aren't taking advantage of this, but I don't really care. This is what I want. And so that day is the day I consider that I became a follower of Jesus. And yeah, so that's how I got tricked into the kingdom by a magician. So later on, I went to a Christian university where I was a music major, but I just continued to grow spiritually. And I was reading the Bible 1 to 2 hours a day, and I was praying 1 to 2 hours a day. And then, and just loving it. And I decided to go to graduate school so I could read the New Testament in its original language, Greek. And as I'm doing this, I'm just loving it. But one day I just asked myself the question, how do I know that this is true? Am I devoting my life to a fairy tale? And so I started to have doubts about my Christian faith. And that's what got me interested in Christian apologetics. Before then, I wasn't interested in Christian apologetics at all. But then I needed it. And that's when I really started to get interested in academic things.
Wow, that's an amazing and beautiful testimony. Thank you so much for sharing with us. Yeah, I think when we are teenagers, we start to question our faith, but we have good and strong reasons to believe that God exists and that Jesus rose from the dead, right?
We do. We've got very strong reasons.
So let's start with the interview. So first of all, I want to talk about one thing that I consider that is important is that some people here in Latin America, most of them atheists, they say that the New Testament or the Gospels doesn't work as a historical document. So the question is, can we trust the Gospel or the New Testament as a historical document?
I think we can, Andrew. I've written an article. Anybody can access it on my website, risenjesus.com. Go to the section titled blog, and it's probably, 2, 3, or 4 down. And there I compare the Gospel of Mark with Suetonius's life of Caesar Augustus. Now, Suetonius he wrote in the early part of the 2nd century, and it's considered or regarded that he wrote closer to modern biographers than any other ancient biographer. And he wrote 12 biographies of the Caesars. That's what he's best known for. And the first 3, his biography of Caesar, his biography of Augustus, his biography of Tiberius, these are the 3 that are considered the finest of the 12. And even of those 3, the one of Augustus is considered his finest one, based on good sources, etc. So what I did was I lay out 4 criteria for assessing it for its historical reliability. That would be, do we have good reasons to think that Suetonius used good judgment in his choice of sources? Second, do we think he used good judgment in his use of those sources? Did he use them responsibly? Third, can we verify a number of items reported? And number 4, we would want it so that no more than a very small percentage of items have a reasonable chance of being false. Now, remember, we're just talking about this about historical reliability in general for ancient literature. We're not talking about whether something's divinely inspired or without error. So I compare Suetonius's life of Augustus with the Gospel of Mark. The Gospel of Mark comes out very well. In fact, just as well, perhaps even slightly better than Suetonius's life of Augustus. So, there are good reasons to think that the Gospel of Mark is reliable, historically reliable, And because John, there's good reasons to think it's based on eyewitness testimony. It seems likely that that is historically reliable. Matthew and Luke are using Mark as their primary source, and where they do this, we can compare how Matthew and Luke use Mark, and we see that they stick closer to their source, Mark, when they use him, than other ancient historians stick to their sources. And so this gives us confidence that Matthew and Luke are doing well with their sources where we can't test them. So, I mean, I could go on and on where we have good reasons to think that the Gospels are rooted in eyewitness testimony, every one of them, that even if they're not written by eyewitnesses, they are rooted in eyewitness testimony, and we can confirm a number of items in them. So, I mean, it's a complex topic. It takes a lot to, we could go down a bunch of different trails with this in terms of authorship and the fact that it's claimed that their authors were biased, and we can talk about contradictions, etc. But yeah, I think there's good reasons to think the Gospels are historically reliable.
I would like to mention something about it. I have heard from William Lane Craig that the Gospels have the same literary genre as the book of Plutarch, which tells of the life of the Greeks and the Romans. Is that true? Because I asked a liberal theologian the same question, and he told me that is incorrect. That is not true. So, what do you think?
No, it is correct. Most New Testament scholars today, regardless of their theological backgrounds, whether they're liberal, moderate, conservative, agnostic, atheist, most New Testament scholars today, by far most, think that the Gospels are either Greco-Roman biographies or that they share they're closely associated with Greco-Roman biography. Plutarch's lives, Plutarch wrote over 60. Plutarch is considered by many classicists to be the greatest of all ancient biographers. He wrote over 60 biographies, of which 48 have survived. And you're right, it's about the Greeks and the Romans mainly. So they are Greco-Roman biographies. So are Suetonius's Lives of the Divine Caesars, those 12, and the Gospel, and so is Philo's Life of Moses. Even though Philo is a Jew, he's a Hellenistic Jew, and he writes 3 biographies: his life of Philo's Life of Moses, his life of Abraham, and life of Joseph. And his life of Philo is much different than his life of Moses and Joseph. Lives of Joseph and life of Joseph and Abraham are very different, but his life of Moses is very much like the Gospels and like Plutarch's lives. They bear so many qualities of it. So the person, your professor you're talking about, that person would go against a large majority of today's New Testament scholars. Yeah, the Gospels do share much in common with Greco-Roman biography.
Well, now another question that is related to that is, were Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John really the ones who wrote the Gospels? And at what time were they written?
Not certain exactly when they were written. There are conflicting dates that have been given, but almost all New Testament scholars place them within the 1st century, and most believe that Mark was written first. They believe Mark was written somewhere between the years 50 and 70. That's where the majority would be, with with the greatest number of that majority falling somewhere between the years 65 and 70. So if Jesus died in the year 30 or 33, we're looking at somewhere between, 35 and 40 years after Jesus' crucifixion, that the Gospel of Mark would have been written. And then Matthew a little after that, Luke a little after, sometime after that. Some place Luke before Matthew, but most place, they're both around the same time. And then John, most place John between the years 90 and 95. In terms of the authorship, we have decent evidence for the traditional authorship of all four Gospels, okay? The majority of scholars today do think they accept the traditional authorship of Mark, and the majority do think that the author of Luke's Gospel was a traveling companion of Paul, although they don't specifically say it was Luke, although Luke would be the best candidate for it. When it comes to John, the majority of scholars, I think John wrote it, John, son of Zebedee, but the majority of scholars today do think that the author of John's Gospel used as his primary, was not John, the son of Zebedee, but whoever it was, used one of Jesus's disciples who had traveled with him, a minor disciple, not one of the 12, but another one who had traveled with him continuously, that was his primary source. So in that case, and because they call it the beloved disciple, some think that that's Lazarus, believe it or not. And there's decent reasons for thinking that. Although I go with John, the son of Zebedee, because that's almost the unanimous testimony of the early church. No one even mentions Lazarus. So we do have some internal evidence, you could say, that suggests Lazarus as the author, but none of the external evidence does, not any of it. So that makes me hesitant to say Lazarus. But either way, it would seem that John is at least rooted in eyewitness testimony. Matthew, I think we have good evidence that points to him as the author. However, there are some problems with that, because that early evidence, which is given by Papias, probably writing in the early part of the 2nd century, and Papias says he got this information from an associate of one of Jesus' apostles while that apostle was still teaching. That means that Papias received this information in the latter part of the 1st century, which is just an amazing source. The problem is that Papias says that Matthew wrote originally in Aramaic, the Hebrew dialect. And the Matthew that we have today is not only in Greek, but it's such a Greek that it appears that it's not translation Greek, that it was originally written in Greek. Now, I don't think this is so problematic. It's a little bit problematic, but here's the way I would explain that. When Papias talks about Matthew being the author, he doesn't call it a gospel. He calls it in Greek the ta logia, the sayings, the teachings. And scholars for years have recognized that there's content in Matthew and Luke that's very similar, but is not in Mark. So in that case, you've got either Luke uses Matthew, Matthew uses Luke for that content, or they both use a common source, which scholars refer to as Q. Q is the abbreviation of the German word Quelle, which simply means source. So it's not this mysterious gospel, lost gospel. The Q source is material that's common to Matthew and Luke, many times verbatim, but it's absent from Mark. This and the Q material is virtually all teachings with very, very little narrative. So this would fit with Papias' statement that Matthew wrote the ta logia, the sayings, the teachings, in the Hebrew dialect, Aramaic. So it could be that that's what Papias was referring to, this Q material, that Matthew later had a scribe, a secretary, translate into Greek, and then under Matthew's direction, he used Mark as his primary source, supplemented it with the Q material and other eyewitness material that Matthew provided. And it's very likely that at least Matthew, Mark, and Luke would have used a scribe, a secretary, to help them compose their Gospels rather than writing them themselves. So this would certainly be in alignment with that. I don't think the Papias thing is much a problem. So I go with the traditional authorship of Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, but I have to admit, it's not unimpeachable. There is some question about Matthew, is some question about John, but in any sense, all four can be said to be rooted in eyewitness testimony.
Amazing. Now, as we know, the resurrection is the center of the Christian faith. And the argument for this is a historical argument, right? But there are many people who mention that this is not a historical argument. So the question is the resurrection a historical argument? And how does a historical argument work?
I do think that a very strong historical case can be made for the resurrection of Jesus. And the way I would argue is the way that you'd approach any other historical question. So, for example, if we were going to look at if we were going to ask, did Julius Caesar cross the Rubicon in January 49 BC, we would look and see, how many sources say that he did. Were these sources independent? How many of them were independent of one another? So if, let's say, Cassius Dio was relying on Suetonius's life of Julius Caesar, well, that's not an independent source. But if you look at Suetonius and Plutarch and Lucan, these could certainly be, we might look at them, they could be independent. You could look at Julius Caesar's commentary, where he talks about at one point he's in Ravenna, and then at another point he's in Ariminum, when you have to cross the Rubicon to get there. So he doesn't mention the Rubicon crossing, but it can be inferred through his writings. So we would look at all the sources. We'd look and say, well, are there eyewitness sources? Are these sources early? Are there any unsympathetic sources who report it? All these kinds of things. And then you look and you say, all right, well, these sources, yeah, some of them may not be the best sources, but you've got multiple independent sources, early eyewitness sources, and you take what they say and you say, what's the best explanation? And that's the kind of stuff that you do with the resurrection of Jesus. We look at our sources. We see that we have very early sources, like Paul, who claims to be an eyewitness of the risen Jesus. Not only was he an eyewitness, he was unsympathetic, even hostile at the time, an enemy of Jesus when he had this experience that he interpreted as the risen Jesus appearing to him, which makes him an even better witness because he wasn't biased in the same way as being a disciple of Jesus. In contrast, or to the contrary, he would have been biased in exactly the opposite direction. So we have an unsympathetic source, an eyewitness. Paul's very early. You also have testimonies rooted in eyewitnesses, such as Mark is rooted in the eyewitness testimony of Peter. You've got John that's at least rooted in an eyewitness testimony of one of Jesus' disciples. So that's just 3 independent sources there, one of which had been hostile at the time. They're rooted in eyewitness testimony too. So, I mean, this is, unless you have an a priori bias just because they're Christian, then we've got really good evidence just in that. And I mean, I could go on through Paul's letters. We can get back to the Jerusalem apostles, Peter, James, John, and others. Yeah. And if you want to say, well, the Christians were biased, well, does that mean that an African-American historian could not write on slavery in the United States because he or she would be biased? Or what about a Jewish historian who wants to write on the Holocaust? They would be biased, especially if some of their family members had been involved. But we wouldn't say they couldn't write on the Holocaust because they'd be biased. In fact, their bias might even drive them to dig deeper and to report more accurately. So, yeah, we can note bias and be careful, but you don't disqualify a source because they're biased. So I think we do have very good evidence. And the things that we do have, the resurrection hypothesis is the very best explanation that can account for the knowable historical facts. Other hypotheses such as hallucinations, stolen body, metaphor, they all fail.
Great. So you mentioned that Paul was hostile to the Christian faith, right? Because
the time of his conversion experience, yes, he was out persecuting Christians. And this isn't just something that's reported in Acts, which would be secondary source because Luke had been a traveling companion with Paul. But Paul himself mentions in his own letters that he had been hostile to the Christian faith and that Jesus appeared to him, and that changed his life.